Okay, so tonight is the last class where we do not move to looking at Paul's letters. After this, you're going to start seeing connections in the book of Acts between the letters that Paul wrote and where he was when he wrote them and all those sorts of connections, which is, in my opinion, one of the great values of a study of the life of Paul, is to understand this is a guy who wrote most of the New Testament. And if you can understand where he was and what he was going through and how he was thinking and his connection to the people that he was writing to, it just opens up the New Testament for you. So this is the last one where we're not doing that. But even now, as we move into this second journey of Paul, you're going to start seeing names more and more that you're familiar with because you connect them to the New Testament, to letters that Paul would write. So you're being introduced to congregations that he was familiar with. This was the first journey that Paul had with Barnabas. It's a circular route. They went in and they took a look at the area, and then from there, after they get to Derbe, they loop right back around and go home. But Paul and Barnabas set up congregations all over the island of Cyprus, and then throughout Antioch and Iconium and Lystra and Derbe, all of that region as well. In chapter 16, well, at the very end of chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas make a decision that they're going to go back and visit those congregations. And so we want to see how they're doing. We are concerned about them and just want to make sure that they're strong and faithful and doing well. Which, by the way, should give us a good reminder that if Paul and Barnabas felt like congregations need regular upkeep and maintenance, guess what? Nothing new under the sun. We're all going to need regular upkeep and maintenance. And the Eastland of today is not necessarily the Eastland of 5 years from now or 10 years from now, right? It's all dependent upon the people and the work and the effort that we put in. So they decide to go and visit these congregations again, but there becomes a dispute over John Mark, who had left them during the first journey, so they decide to split. And so Barnabas takes John Mark, they head down to the island of Cyprus. Paul takes Silas, and they head up over the top, not going across the sea, and head up really likely past Paul's hometown of Tarsus on their way to places like Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and Antioch. In Derbe and Lystra, they pick up Timothy, and this is really where we left off 2 weeks ago. I was gone last week, and Josh kindly filled in for me. They pick up Timothy, and Timothy is of a mixed ethnic background. His mother is Jewish, his father is Greek. Paul has him circumcised. We've just got done earlier in the book dealing with the fact that circumcision is not necessary, but they do it not out of doctrinal necessity, but out of the desire to preach the gospel. And so here you have Timothy. He's voluntarily circumcised in order to be an evangelist. He had grown up and been around when Paul had come through the first time. And when he came through the first time, Paul had gotten stoned for preaching. And so Timothy decides to join this guy who it's very obvious you are putting your life at risk. So really never doubt who Timothy is. And Paul will later in his writings say that I have no man like-minded. Timothy, I sometimes worry because when Paul talks to Timothy and tells Timothy God has not given us a spirit of timidity, I'd like to imagine Timothy as a timid person who has to be told that. I am afraid that timid for Timothy is still probably braver than Scott on his bravest day. That's my concern, is that Timothy was timid by Paul's standards, but not timid by 2023 America standards. And so these guys, Paul with his entourage, go on this fairly epic journey. They visit the congregations that they had been to before. And then once they reach Antioch, the journey they've now hit unknown or unvisited territory. They've not gone to these places before any further west than Antioch. And so now we pick up a new section of journey. We're moving to new territory. And if you look in Acts 16, as they leave and pass through the cities, it says they were delivering the decrees which had been decided upon by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem. That was in regard to the relationship between Jews and Gentiles who converted to Christ, and the fact that you are not becoming a Jew, you are becoming a Christian, so a Gentile does not need to undertake the Jewish rites of keeping the Sabbath or circumcision or things like that. So they're delivering those. And it says the churches were strengthened in faith. We're established. And we're increasing in number daily. So things are going very, very well. And yet, Paul's going to continue to travel on. I mean, you can imagine, just kind of put yourself in Paul's shoes. If you were at a congregation and it was growing in numbers daily, what's the average preacher going to say? What? I need a raise? Yeah, you're clever. Raise your hand next time. Average preacher's probably going to say, this is where I'm needed. Look at all these doors of opportunity. I should stay put. This is good work. We should keep at it. Paul says, keep going. Keep moving. And Paul will talk about that in his letters, that he desired to put the seed in parts of the world where nobody else had been, to do work in areas that had not already been sown. And so you see that pattern even here as he's going back over territory that he was the one who sowed the seed there. It was him and Barnabas. He says, no, let's keep moving. So they will leave that territory, and from there in Acts chapter 16, it says they passed through the Phrygian and Galatian region, having been forbidden by the Holy Spirit to speak the word in Mysia. Holy Spirit to speak the word in Asia, and after they came to Mysia, they were trying to go into Bithynia, and the Spirit of Jesus did not permit them. Paul will later say in his Galatian letter that the first time that he went to Galatia, which is not a city but a region, the first time that he went to that region, he'll say in Galatians 4, it was because of a bodily illness that I preached the gospel to you the first time. You might be familiar with that term that Paul uses, that it's a thorn in the flesh. He had some sort of physical ailment that hindered him, that made his life difficult. There's no way of knowing for sure what that physical ailment was. We know that it was the type of thing that caused him constant frustration because he prayed continually that it be removed, and God said no. There is a decent guess, I would say, is that it had something to do with his eyes. And the reason for that is, I mean, we're just working with as minimal data as what we've got, is one, as he spoke to the Galatians, it seems to be that he refers to his eyes several times. He said, you know, if you could have plucked your own eyes out, you would have given them to me. Well, that seems to imply that when the Galatians saw Paul having struggles with his eyes, they were like, we've got healthy eyes. We'd give it to you if we could, which of course you can't. It doesn't work that way. So that's one reason that people tend to think it might be an eye issue. Another is, when Paul would write letters, most of the time he didn't do the writing. He would dictate it, and somebody else would write it, but occasionally he would include a section in his own hand. And at least on one occasion, he said, look with what large letters I write to you. And his point being, you can tell it's my handwriting, it's big letters. Well, that again seems to point towards him potentially having some sort of eye issue. Do we know that for sure? No. Does it necessarily matter? No. Is it interesting? Yeah. So I tell you. Okay, so he heads into this Galatian region and spends quite a bit of time there, but in Acts you don't really read about it. I mean, when you read in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 16, it simply says they passed through the Phrygian and Galatian region. Move along. But there's a whole history of events there that Galatians will later tell you about, and a relationship that Paul had with the brethren that he will lean upon when he writes the Galatian letter to them. Because when Paul writes Galatians, he's going to be pretty upset with them. The book of Galatians begins with Paul really chastising them and saying, I'm just amazed that you have left the gospel for some fake counterfeit. And he will really lambast them. But then he'll go in and say, that's not who you are. I remember who you are. You were the people who, when I had an ailment, you would have done anything to help me. That even though I looked in some way unsavory, which is likely had to do with that ailment, whatever it was, you treated me like an angel from heaven had come to visit you. So there's this whole relationship that begins in half of a verse. And I tell you that because it's important for us to understand that Acts is not a comprehensive history of the life of Paul. It doesn't tell you everything. It's not Instagram photos of everything he had for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's just a general history that hits on the high points that we need to know. And in the context of Acts, you don't need to know all the things that he did in Galatia. But when you go to the Galatian letter, you will get some added detail that he spent quite a bit of time there. And he also didn't go there because he wanted to go there. He went there because he was sick. And so whether it was there were doctors in that region and that would be helpful, or whether he went to that region because and couldn't travel any further because of ailments, whatever it was, he was sidelined from his plan, which was to continue on that northwest trajectory. He stopped. And this is another thing to know about Paul. Paul had a lot less control over his journeys than we give him credit for. We tend to go, well, look at Paul's plan. Paul went here and Paul went there. No. Paul was shoved. Paul spent a lot of his life being shoved and nudged and pushed by the Lord to go different places. And Galatia was no different. He went there and he preached the gospel to them for the first time because he knew Galatia was a region that needed the gospel. And what Galatians says, I preached to you the first time, and that which was a trial to you in my bodily condition you did not despise or loathe. That's why. It was a bodily illness that led him to Galatia, and because of that, the gospel spread to a whole region. If Paul hadn't gotten sick, you wouldn't have that letter. That's another way to think of it. If Paul had not had whatever illness he had, you wouldn't have the letter to the Galatians because he wouldn't have had that relationship with them. So, I say that all to say, the Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? And so you just don't know. One of the great things to learn about Paul is that there were many of the most important things that he did in his life were completely out of his control, that he ended up there and he just simply followed the journey. Anybody have any comments or questions or thoughts? Anything to add there before we move forward? Okay. So now Paul has this other problem in the second half of that verse. So verse 6 begins with him traveling through Phrygia and Galatia, ending up somewhere he didn't plan on going. But then the second half tells you there was some place he did want to go, which is he wanted to go to Asia. Now Asia, he'll eventually go there. Asia is down on that southwest corner of the land there. The central point of Asia is probably the location in Asia you would be most familiar with, which is Ephesus. Paul wants to go there. He wanted to go down to Asia. He wants to go to Ephesus. He wants to travel to that region. It's everything Paul wants when he's preaching. It has a bustling city with people from all over the world, trade routes that come to it. It's exactly the point that if you are a preacher like Paul, who wants to get to the center of where people are so you can preach the gospel of Jesus and then they'll go everywhere, Ephesus and Asia, that's where you want to be. So Paul has plans. But what's the Holy Spirit do? Yeah, he changed some of them. That's right, he forbids him. So Paul, okay, fine. I can't. I want to go there. So I can't. Well, then I'll go to Mysia. And passing by Mysia, he's trying to go into Bithynia. Well, that's up north. he's told, no, you can't go there either. So essentially what happens with Paul is he's just kind of nudged back and forth in his journeys like a cow in a chute. So he's going to end up exactly in Troas. Not because he wanted to be in Troas, not because that's his plans, but it's because it's the Holy Spirit's plans. Because it's God's plans. Paul has no interest in being there. He wants to be in all these other areas. Troas is essentially at the end of the earth, and after that you head into Macedonia, which is Greece. And Greece is where the really bad people are. That's where the real troublemakers are, because once you head to Greece, you're on your way to Rome. Right? We want to preach the word to Gentiles, but let's not go that far. There's so many other places that we could be. And yet he ends up there in Troas, and that is what will lead to arguably the most effective half of this journey. And beyond that, potentially even the most effective season of Paul's preaching, which is when he leaves this area and heads into Macedonia and Achaia. So I will say again, here you have Paul. He ends up in Galatia, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Circumstances. And then there's a bunch of places he wants to go that he can't go. So the things that Paul wants to do, he can't do. And the things that he doesn't want to do, he does end up having to do. And it really shows you why Paul will say, in multiple places, but 1 Corinthians 4 is a very good example of it, I'll come to you soon if the Lord wills. This is a guy who learned, you start saying if the Lord wills, because every time you have a plan, God's going to laugh. He's going to say, did you check with me on that plan? Because that's not necessarily my plan. Paul's, from what we can tell, pretty organized guy. He's certainly very driven, right? And what do you tend to find with organized, driven people? Tend to be planners, right? They tend to say, I'm going to do this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing. Paul is being humbled. And in my opinion, this is one of those lessons that you see Paul learning, that if we can learn through him, will change our life. Okay, anybody have any thoughts or questions or anything like that? Okay. So from Troas, he's essentially just sitting there. And in verse 9, it says, a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing and appealing to him and saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And when he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So Paul's efforts to go to Macedonia were driven by this vision. I guess maybe another added detail to add is he was in Troas, which is kind of, from the standpoint of the landmass, right? Troas is right on the edge. You have to hit water if you want to go any further west. And so Troas is probably not a place he would end up. Yet, pop quiz. When you think about events that happen in Troas, there's a pretty big event that happens in Troas that has changed the way we worship. Later on in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 20, down in verse 7, where is it? Where is it that we see them taking the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week? It's in Troas. That's it. In Acts chapter 20, you're going to have Paul leaving Macedonia. And when he leaves Macedonia, he ends up going to Troas. And that's where we get Acts 7, where it says that on the first day of the week, when the brethren were gathered together to break bread, Paul preached to them. That's the verse we go to find the context of we take the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. So the very first place that we ever see the Lord's Supper being taken the first day of the week, not that they were the first ones to do it, but they're the ones we read about it, happens at a congregation that probably doesn't exist if Paul hadn't been shoved to Troas. So just these little details, right? Paul's not ending up where he would have chosen, but it's doing great things. So he ends up then from there going into Macedonia. So Macedonia is Greek territory. And so he'll cross over the land. I'll back up here. If you look up at the very top of the screen there, you can see Philippi. I could have adjusted the map to put Philippi easier to see, but then I'd have to adjust the map. That sounds like a lot of work. So it's right at the upper top corner is Philippi. That's as far north as you have to worry about for this journey anyway. So Philippi is over in Macedonian territory. They're going to have to take a boat to get there. But then when you get to Philippi, you run into this thing called the Via Egnatia. And that circled section is a part of the Via Egnatia that still exists. You can still find the Via Egnatia because the Romans built roads. That's whenever you see via something, that just means a road. So it's like they would say we'd say I-5 or something like that, right? Via Egnatia is a major Roman road. And they built them so well that they really, really lasted. And so many of them are still driven on today. I could have an entire conversation with you about how Romans do concrete way better than us, but probably would bore you. There might be an engineer or two that would think it's really cool. Look up Roman concrete, though, just on your own time. But Via Egnatia goes right through Philippi. And Philippi is described as a Roman colony. This is the first event like this. What we're seeing Paul do is move farther and farther afield from everything that is Paul. Right? Paul is a Jew of Jews. Like, I'm a certain kind of guy from a certain part of the world who's used to dealing with Jewish customs and Jewish lifestyles and Jewish idioms and Jewish education. And the further he moves to the west, the less that matters. Philippi is a Roman colony, and one of the aspects of it is we're going to break Paul's cycle. Every city Paul goes into, we've talked about what's his pattern. What's the first thing he does when he's going to evangelize? Where does he go? He goes to the synagogue, right? Roman colonies don't have synagogues. They don't allow it. A Roman colony says, no, we're Roman, and so the only sort of worship and religion that's done in the city limits is Roman. You Jews go down to the river. Sure enough, that is exactly what happens in Philippi, is that Paul comes into the city of Philippi, and there isn't a synagogue, and so he'll eventually end up going down to the water, where he meets Lydia and some other women that are worshiping, but totally different culture. The things that he's leaned on in the past of, let's go into the synagogue, and then we'll preach there, then they'll get mad at us, but the Gentiles will like us, so they'll kick us out, and it'll all be fun. Like, he doesn't get to do that this time. Totally, totally different. And one way to think of that is, as we're trying to understand Paul, he's leaving his comfort zone further and further behind. This is nothing like the world he's from, and yet, when you and I think of Paul, and we think about the life he lives and the difference that he made, you start thinking about the letters that he wrote. Galatians, to a church or to churches in a region that he did never plan on even going. Philippians, which is going to be written to the church that starts here in this city that's a Roman colony. 1st and 2nd Corinthians, which is going to be even further west in a very pagan area. Corinth is going to be the equivalent of Las Vegas, right? Sin City, who's going to preach there, and just on and on and on. And then, arguably, the most impressive book Paul will ever write in terms of the beauty of understanding what Christianity is Romans, which is in the heart of this non-Jewish culture. So the more uncomfortable Paul becomes, the more effective he becomes. You hanging with me on some life lessons that might be there? As we look at Paul, his effectiveness doesn't happen where he wants to be. It happens where he needs to be. And I'm convinced that that's probably true for the rest of us. That when you start putting the Lord in charge, you're prayerful about it, and you just stop fighting, all of a sudden he puts you places you never expected to be, doing stuff you never expected to be doing, but it's good stuff. So Philippi is planted right in the middle of Via Egnatia because it's a Roman colony, and Roman colonies are set up by giving Roman soldiers land. What Rome did is they said, look, we'll give you room and board while you're in the military, but once you're done, which by the way only means we pay you if you survive, we'll give you a bunch of land where we want. And what Rome would do is they would give land in places that were militarily important. So Philippi, right at this crossroad, is a city built up of Roman soldiers and that military culture. And you could think about that in America. We have the same thing, right? You have cities that grow up around military installations, right? You have Fort Knox, and there's stuff around it because there's soldiers there, and they have money, and then they can spend that money, and then they want to buy houses and all that sort of stuff. So you build. That's what Philippi is, and it affects the culture of a town, right? So here he ends up in Philippi, and it is entering an entirely different area. Anybody have any comments or thoughts or questions about this so far? I know there's a lot of places and dates and things like that, and I'm hoping that we can do it in a way that you connect to it, and it's not like that awful history professor that made you hate history, right? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-mm. Yeah. And even that concentric kind of circle of increase is, you can even add it to his initial desire, which was just to preach in Jerusalem. Like, I'm perfect to preach to these people, so he stays there, and he wants to stay, and the Lord kicks him out. And yeah, the next journey's bigger, and then bigger than that, and then bigger than that. And so, yeah, the Lord continues to progress in his usage of Paul over time. And this is done over the course of years, not weeks. That's the other thing, is it's like, by the time Paul's the most effective guy that he'll ever be, he will refer to himself as Paul the Aged. So he's going through a lifetime journey of learning these things as well. So yeah, you're right. Those circles, they just get bigger as you go. Okay, so with Philippi, when he gets there, we're going to run into some language that I want to take a moment to deal with, because one, it can be confusing in the same way that we've talked about in the past. There have been other statements in the New Testament that seem to put it almost backwards, because typically what we think of is we say, look, the person has choice. The gospel's just preached, and then that's people choose. But sometimes the language of the Bible puts it the other way, where here you have Lydia is listening to Paul preach, and it says, whose heart the Lord opened. So, she's listening, but it says the Lord opened her heart. And then you have other places like in Corinth where Paul will be preaching there, and he's worried, and God says, keep preaching because I have many people here. And it seems to make you think, well, wait a second. Is he saying they're already Christians? They're already saved? What does he mean by that, to put it that order? Who's in charge? Right? Who's in charge? When God says, when it says the Lord opened her heart, that seems to make you think like Lydia didn't have a lot of control there. Like, she was just kind of, the Lord zapped her and said, you're going to be a Christian. Which, if you want to read it that way, matches some false doctrines that are out there that do seem to imply that idea that choice doesn't matter. I don't believe that that's the case here, and the same way I don't think it's the case in other places. But the question we ask is, how did God open Lydia's heart? So here's Paul. Lydia's there at this place of prayer down by the river on the Sabbath day. Paul goes down and he's preaching, and it says the Lord had opened her heart. Well, how did he do that? And I'm going to answer that by asking a different question. How did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Because if you answer that question, you can answer the Lydia question. In Exodus chapter 4, God says of Pharaoh, back in the Old Testament, I will harden his heart. Now, one way to look at that is, look, if God's hardening the heart of Pharaoh in the Old Testament, he doesn't let the people go and everything because God's hardening his heart. Well, if God's hardening his heart, is it Pharaoh's fault that he's a bad guy? Well, sounds like it's not, right? You could kind of think, well, it's not really his fault at all. But, raise your hand if you think Pharaoh's a bad guy. Yeah, I think he's a bad guy too. Well, the reason is because there's a way to harden somebody's heart that still involves choice. The magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So this is Moses had performed a miracle, and then Pharaoh turns to the magicians, and they pull a trick that looks a lot like the miracle. And so what happens with Pharaoh's heart? He saw Moses perform this miracle, and then he looks over the magicians, and they do some smoke and mirrors thing that looks the same. And so he says, well, Moses did it, but my magicians did it. So what's the conclusion for Pharaoh? Harden my heart. They're the same. Doesn't matter. Right? 2, when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, meaning that there was a break from the different plagues. This is another thing that happened, right? God would send a plague, and then after the plague, Pharaoh would go, whoa, so sorry, really bad, stop that, no more blood in the river. And so God he would give them respite. He would give them a break. Well, what happens at the break? Here in Exodus 8, what happens? He hardens his heart. Whose fault is that? Pharaoh's, but who gave him the respite? Okay. So now here's the crux of it, right? And Perry's right. God knew Pharaoh's heart, the kind of person he is. And he knows he's the kind of person that if God performs a miracle, but then his magicians can do a smoke and mirror, he's not going to dig deeper for the truth. He's just going to go, what? It's fake, right? He knows he's the kind of guy that he might feel sorry for a couple of minutes when all of a sudden the punishment's real bad, but as soon as the punishment goes away, he goes right back to being a bad guy. You know anybody, people like that? That they, oh, I'm so sorry, but then as soon as the consequences are gone, right back at it. God knows he's that kind of person. So God creates a series of circumstances that highlight that heart. So yes, God is hardening his heart because God knows that if you boil an egg, what happens to it? It gets hard. And he knows Pharaoh's an egg. He's a big goose egg. And so God just does that. He creates circumstances to do that. Exodus 9, when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, another respite, right? He sinned yet again and hardened his heart. And so you see a character trait, and God is using that kind of a person and putting him in circumstances that highlight how horrible he is and really bring the worst out of him. And we have examples of God doing that with people throughout the Bible, where God takes people who are not good people and then puts them in circumstances where, the environment highlights their awfulness, right? Well, if God can do that, why can't he do the opposite? Why can't he look at somebody like Lydia and say, I see the quality of person that is there, that she has a very soft heart. And so if God wants to highlight the softness of her heart, what is he going to do? Yeah, he's going to create the environment to highlight that. And that also matches God's character because we know that God desires people to be saved. Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And the circumstances highlight something, but it might highlight the exact opposite in same circumstance, but two different people, right? Moses was at the same moment as Pharaoh, but obviously had a different takeaway. And many of the Egyptians were in the same moment, and they would give their things to the Israelites, saying, look, remember us and pray for us. So you're right. You can have this exact same circumstance. Lydia is a potato, has less of a ring to it. But it's very true nonetheless. Yeah, I think you have an environment there. And so, I like to look at it like this. You have Lydia's heart, and God opens it in the same way that he hardened Pharaoh's. He put circumstances there. Well, this is the God who took Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke, and he puts them in this Macedonian city, and he puts them there at the river at the exact same time that this woman is there to preach the words that she very much needs to hear. And that's all the providential care of God, putting the right people together to highlight that. And we have to remember the character of God is such that he wants people to be saved. Right? He's not looking to send people to hell. He's looking to keep them from that. And I cannot iterate that enough, that who we worship does not want you to go to hell. He wants you to go to heaven. And so when he sees people who have soft hearts, he is seeking to reach those people. He's seeking to get to them. He's seeking to put them in circumstances that will bring the best out of them. That's his desire. And so I think that's the case with Lydia. And the reason that he couldn't bring the best out in Pharaoh is because there wasn't a best to be brought out. I would put it that way. Any other comments or questions or things like that before we move forward? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Gotta go home. Yeah. No, I wasn't going to cover it, and I'm glad you said it, because what I think I put up on the chart, that they might preach to an Asian Jewish woman after being forbidden to preach in Asia, and I forgot to say anything, because you're right. That's a huge point, right? So here it is, Paul can't go to Asia, but he can preach to a woman. She can go to Asia. And so it's like the Lord does what he wants, and he does it in elegant ways, very different ways than what we would do ourselves. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It doesn't work that way. Yeah, yeah, and create circumstances that are conducive if they want to, right? I mean, he's a God who's trying to save, and yeah, right. Yep, yep. And there comes a point where you go, well, okay, I don't think the problem's God, right? So yeah, absolutely. One other thing to mention here is we have a change of language. In verse 6, it said they passed through the Phrygian and Galatian region. And then when you get down to verse 11, so putting out to sea from Troas, we ran a straight course to Samothrace. Well, we includes somebody who's not been included up to this point, which is the writer of the book. And so at Troas, we add Luke. So now we have another traveling companion. We have Paul, we have Silas, we have Timothy, and we have Luke. And you can follow the life of Luke simply by following the we's. we do this, and then they did that, tells you where Luke is at any given moment. So there's this like added little detail you can follow through, which is kind of fun as you're going through the book of Acts, of seeing these individual people and the work that they're doing and how the Lord is using them. And Luke does not highlight the things that he did. That's not the central focus of the book, but it's in there. It's in there if you're looking at the details. Okay. We'll very quickly go through this, but in Philippi, Paul and Silas are imprisoned. They end up visiting the magistrate's house. Interestingly, in verse 22, where it says the crowd rose up together against them, and the chief magistrates tore their robes off them and proceeded to order them to be beaten with rods. This is some of the ruins of Philippi, and that door is the magistrate's door. All that's left of the house, but the door's there. And so we actually we can know with some level of certainty where some of these things were happening. It's just kind of a cool detail there. Paul and Silas will be thrown in prison. And while thrown in prison, I don't know who that guy is, but he gave me the best shot of a Philippian prison. So, he's just forever in my slides, like the guy with the what do you call that hat? A flat hat? Flat cap, yeah. Yeah, I have one like that, and my kids say I look old when I wear it. Just take that for what it's worth. That was an incidental piece of data you didn't need. But this is what a Philippian jail looked like. Not like what we would think of prison. It's dark, it's cold, it's dank, it's not a comfortable sort of circumstance. And that's where you have Paul and Silas singing, and the people hearing them sing, and the good that is coming from that. And so Paul and Silas will be in prison there, but then at the end of all of that, in verse 35, when after this conversion of the Philippian jailer, they will come back and they will want to they decide, well, we don't have any good reason to keep you in prison. And so the chief magistrate sent the policeman in verse 35 saying, release those men. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the chief magistrates have sent to release you, therefore come out now and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans. So now we have an added detail. Paul's a Roman, but who else is? Silas. We've got Silas the Roman too, right? Men who are Romans. And have thrown us into prison, and now they're sending us away secretly. No, indeed, but let them come themselves and bring us out. Paul flexes some political and legal muscle here. He felt comfortable saying, look, you didn't have a right to put us in prison. You come and get us out. And that would be a big deal that they just threw them into prison as Romans, because what's Philippi? Roman colony. And so the gospel ends up having more peace in Philippi than any other place. Nobody's going to mess with the Christians there because they did it once and got themselves in big legal trouble. From that day forward, Paul will leave, Silas will leave, but Lydia and others and the Christians of that area, that church will be one of the most stable ones that ever existed because of what Paul and Silas went through. So we will leave off there. We will continue on Paul's journeys. Starting next week, we'll move into places like Thessalonica and Berea and Athens and whatnot. So thank you so very much.